States of America was born. And when last I left you, we were talking about how King George III was not necessarily open to listening to any of the Continental Congress's requests, given that he is the king of the most powerful empire in the world. He didn't really feel it was necessary. So he refused to yield, and tensions continued to rise. And the Second Continental Congress was meeting. And during this time, some fighting happened to break out in two places, Lexington and Concord. Both were on the same day, but basically the general that was had occupied Boston, his name was Thomas Gage, and he heard that the rebels had been hiding some ammunition and some clothing and some artillery, and two of the leaders of the resistance, and Samuel Adams and John Hancock, in Lexington. And so he deployed just some troops there, and they encountered some resistance in the form of just farmers, militiamen. And those farmers were butchered, annihilated pretty harshly, but the ones that were able to survive retreated to Concord, where they spread the message about the British being on their way, that the British were looking for John Hancock and Sam Adams, and basically they were able to mount a force of like 4,000 people, and they were able to defeat the British at Concord on that very day. So all of this just kind of rouses the American idea that Great Britain can and should be defeated. One such person who's responsible for spreading this idea is a man by the name of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, that's a picture of him in the top left. In January of 1776, he begins to publish an issue in a pamphlet called Common Sense. Now, what Common Sense was a pamphlet that made the argument for independence from Great Britain. Because there was still a significant portion of the American colonial population that had wanted nothing to do with independence. They wanted to be faithful, loyal British subjects. So in very frank and easy to understand language, Thomas Paine denounced the corrupt British monarchy of King George III and offered several logical reasons why the United States should break ties with England. One such argument, he uses common sense. That's why it's called this. Like, nowhere else in the universe, like he's literally talking about the universe, does a larger body revolve around a smaller body when it comes to matter and mass. The Earth revolves around the sun because the sun is larger. The moon revolves around the Earth because the Earth is larger. Why should the United States, which is much larger than a little tiny island of Great Britain, revolve around it? Why should we be subject to it? So he offers common sense arguments like that. What common sense does, it really galvanizes or strengthens the American public against Great Britain and against trying to make up with them, against reconciliation. And so, as the Second Continental Congress continues to meet, on June the 7th of 1776, a delegate from Virginia named Richard Henry Lee, he puts forth a motion to the Second Continental Congress that the United States ought to be, or that the bond between Great Britain and the American colonies should be dissolved. And basically he calls for independence, the formation of a new country. And not everybody was pumped for that at the Second Continental Congress. Not everybody was on board for it. And it took about a month of haggling and deal making and backdoor decisions and shady deals and several drinks at the pub to get everybody on the same page. But in that time, it was thought that it was very possible. And so the Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, they appointed a committee of 5 men to work on an expression of what will happen if this comes to pass, if the United States becomes the United States, if we declare our independence. And those 5 men began to draft a document, but it was really one man who gets the credit for it, and that is Thomas Jefferson. And he creates, with the assistance of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and Robert Livingston and Roger Sherman, the Declaration of Independence. Now, from the time Thomas Jefferson wrote it to the time it was actually published, it was changed many a time. But basically, in very simple but eloquent language, Thomas Jefferson sets out the reason for our separation from Great Britain. So it really only has a couple parts to it. First is it is like the marriage, like we pretend like we're married to Great Britain, like it's the divorce document. Like this is why we are getting divorced. We are separating from you. We are dissolving the ties that have connected us to you. And that's kind of what the first sentence is. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected us to another. That's the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence. So that's the first part. The second part is a list of reasons why. And Thomas Jefferson provides 27 things, 27 grievances against the King of England. 27 things. And they're pretty simple. Like, the king is a tyrant. The king has incited Indians to want to kill us. The king has taxed us unfairly. The king has hired mercenaries to come and kill us. The king has done this. The king has done about 27 legitimate grievances that Thomas Jefferson lists in the Declaration of Independence. So, in addition, a third component, which is probably one of the more important ones, is Thomas Jefferson includes a lot of philosophy from John Locke. Do you guys remember talking about John Locke? Yeah, he was the Enlightenment guy and came up with the social contract theory. Well, John Locke was a proponent of the social contract theory, which holds that governments exist on the basis of the consent of the governed, that it's the people's responsibility to govern themselves. This is a new idea because the people were not able to govern themselves anywhere in the world. But Thomas Jefferson calls for that in the Declaration of Independence. And he steals these ideas from people like John Locke, who say that government's real purpose is to protect people's property, to protect people's life, to protect people's liberty. And Thomas Jefferson steals it and changes a little bit and says life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So, furthermore, Locke argued that individuals who give their consent to the governed, if they don't like what the government does with their permission, they can overthrow the government and start over. It's called the right of revolution. And we do that in America when it comes to certain offices, depending upon what it is, every year, every 2 years, every 4 years. If you don't like the way the government's going, you go vote and you throw them out. That's your right. And that is called the right of revolution. Americans have that. All right? These are new ideas in 1776. If you didn't like the King of England, what did you do? You sucked it up and you kept your mouth shut. Or you spoke out and were shot. Those are your options. Okay? Whereas in America, we wanted to have, not only do we want to control the government, if the government doesn't do what we want it to do, we'll overthrow them. That's part of the American experience. So, leaders were really subject to the whims of the people. So, before the Declaration of Independence, written, Thomas Jefferson. Then we have to win the war, which eventually we do. Big spoiler alert. We defeat the British. And they surrender to George Washington at Yorktown. But during this time, we have to create a new. So now what? We get to create a new government without any influence from any other foreign nation. We can do whatever we want. And so the first attempt at a new government It's called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation. Now, this was passed and became the first official government of America late in 1777. So during the war, this was what we had, the Articles of Confederation. It is a confederacy. What does that mean?
It's a joint union between states.
That's right. It's a loose association between the states, where every state has its own power. All right? The United States is the only place in the world where our states are not countries. Everywhere else in America, on the planet Earth, a state is a country. China is a state. Canada is a state. The United States is a state. Within the United States, that's why our name is what it is, because the Articles of Confederation. We wanted to be a collection of our own of nations. Like we wanted to act like every state was its own nation, and they were loosely affiliated together under the Articles of Confederation. All right? So it's basically a loose league of friendship between the 13 sovereign, independent states, colonies, okay? So that's why the Articles created a confederation. They wanted the states to have more power than the federal government. Why would they be so fearful of having a strong federal government? Because they just overthrew a king who was oppressive, and they did not want to have another oppressive, strong central authority. But the Articles of Confederation, I mean, it's a failure, huge failure.
I think I can make it work now.
Think you can make it work
I
now?
can do it.
Why?
I don't know. I just feel like I can do it. I feel like it's time.
Yeah?
I think I can make it work.
I don't know. It's a pretty big problems. Pretty big problems. Commerce is a big problem. So, but what it could do, what powers it did have, it could print money called continental money. Have you ever heard the expression that ain't worth a continental?
No. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's because the continental money they printed was worthless. It was worthless. But they did have the power to make peace, treaties, coin money, control post office, negotiate with Indian tribes. Those are things it could do. It had a unicameral legislature where each state sent one delegate. So there were 13 members of the entire government. One vote in the legislature, and didn't matter what size your state was. Rhode Island had the same as Virginia. And it took a vote of 9 out of 13 to pass anything. And if you wanted to make changes to the government, it had to be unanimous. So those are some of the powers that it had. But you think this is going to work? I've already told you it's failure, so hopefully everybody will say no. You think this will work? Oh, you guys are so smart. There are going to be some problems associated with the Articles of Confederation. More than 250 years ago, Americans had great loyalties to their states. For example, like if you were to go out overseas, let's say you go to Germany, and somebody says, "Where are you from?" You say, I'm from the United States, because you're not in the United States. You say, "I'm an American." Well, that was not so. If you left the United States 250 years ago, you'd say, "Well, I'm from Virginia," because you were more loyal to your state than you were to your federal government. Yeah, state. Yeah. Well, not quite statism, but you just had a non-federal loyalty. Okay, people were patriotic toward their state. So many people often didn't even think of themselves as Americans. They didn't say, "I'm an American." They say, "I'm a Virginian. I'm a Georgian. I'm a New Yorker." Okay, so this lack of national identity or loyalty, especially when there was after the war was over, the absence of war, really failed to unite our citizenry, and so we were really reluctant to give too much power to the central government. So although the federal government had powers like coining money, they had no resources to back it up. They had no gold. They had no authority to say, yeah, we're printing this money and it's worth stuff, which is kind of what we do now, the Federal Reserve Bank. We don't have gold or anything to back up. We just print it, and the government says it's worth stuff, and we believe them. So, but the art. If we could sum up the word, a word of this really sums up the Articles of Confederation, it would be weak. It is a very weak government. And its greatest weakness was its failure to provide for strong central authority. It really didn't even have a judicial branch. It had no judicial system. It had a very lame executive. His name is John Hanson. You ever heard of him?
No.
He was chosen to be the first person to preside over the Congress of Confederation. Many people say he's the first president of the United States. But he's not president. He's the first to preside over the Congress of Confederation. The office of president did not exist because our executive branch was non-existent. It was lame. Just because he can preside over the Congress means nothing. He just runs the meeting. He has no power or authority. He just runs the meeting. Okay? So it had no judicial system to handle the growing number of economic conflicts, boundary disputes among the states. So just very weak. Had no power to tax. None whatsoever. No power to tax. But they did have the authority to raise an army. How do you raise an army?
Volunteers.
Okay, we get volunteers. And do you pay them? Well, if they're volunteering, you don't. But how long do you think they're going to stick around when they got crops coming in and they're not making any money?
Probably not long.
Well, not too long, especially when they have no money. And so what happens to the size of our military as a result of the Articles of Confederation? It shrinks to almost being non-existent, which is not a good thing, especially in a young infant nation. Isaiah.
Yeah.
Sit up, bud. All right, so these are just a few of the weaknesses that they had, and then all of these weaknesses get exposed when one particular event happened, and that is Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion. In 1780, many of the states, including Massachusetts, adopted a constitution that appeared to favor the interests of wealthy people. Property owning requirements, when it came to things like voting, speaking, really banned lower and middle class citizens from democracy. Couldn't vote, couldn't hold office. So not the most democratic states and country in the 1780s. And as the economy of Massachusetts was declining in the 1780s, many banks were foreclosing on farms. And a great majority of these farms were owned by Massachusetts Continental Army veterans, people who had just fought in the American Revolution, who were promised bonuses from the national government for their service to the nation. Who promised them those bonuses? Who'd they fight for?
America.
They fought for the United States of America. Why didn't the United States of America pay them their bonus?
We have no money.
Because the United States of America has no money. And so these people who were expecting to be paid by the United States government are now having their farms foreclosed on and taken from them by the state because they can't pay their taxes. They can't make their mortgage payments. Is this happening to wealthy people? No, it's happening to your basic, I got a wife and 4 kids and we own this piece of land and we farm it and we survive. Well, you take my land away, we're homeless and we're going to starve to death. So frustration and outrage was growing in places like Massachusetts. One particular person, whose name was Daniel Shays, he was a former Continental Army captain. He and 1,500 of his closest disgruntled farmers marched together to the government arsenal where guns and ammunition and weapons were held at in Springfield, Massachusetts, where they stormed the arsenal and armed themselves. So now you have angry, motivated, poor, armed, and trained killers marching toward the Capitol. And now, so let's say you're the governor of Massachusetts. What do?
Run.
Okay. What do?
Call the.
Hey, I need help. So I'm going to write a letter to the federal government. Like, hey, you guys send the army here. I got 1,500 armed dudes marching right here, right now. And that's what he does. And guess what the federal government replies?
It's a state problem.
Hey, we have, what army you want us to send? We don't have one because we have no money. You didn't give us any, and we don't have an army. Use your state militia. Your state militia should be very strong and powerful. And the governor says, the state militia is the one that's marching here. They're the ones that, they're the trained soldiers. They're the veterans. They're the ones that know how to use the guns. So this is a major problem. Do you see how the Articles of Confederation is weak and the federal government can't even protect its own people? So eventually, George Washington comes out of retirement and he goes and he puts the rebellion down. Mostly peacefully, but he himself foots the bill for it and goes and stops them. Like, guys, look, I know we fought together and we're going to work this out. Okay, you're not going to lose your farms, I promise. We're going to work this out. So, but that's what Shays' Rebellion, why it's so important is that it shows how weak the Articles of Confederation is and the need for what?
Reform. Change.
Stronger central authority. That's what it really shows. Okay? So, we need a miracle. And a miracle is pretty much what we get when we have a meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, where several states joined together to have a meeting for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. What's the purpose of the meeting at 1787 in Philadelphia? To revise the Articles of Confederation. What happens?
We changed it.
They completely just throw it in the trash and start over. They allowed to do that?
Why not?
What was required in order to make changes to the... It had to be unanimous. Well, Rhode Island didn't even show up. Can you make changes?
No.
Nope.
Legally, no.
Let's start over. And that's what they did. They just made it up. So when you hear about government politicians, doing things that are illegal, it's not uncommon. Our nation's built on doing illegal things. Just making it up. Okay? So these 55 delegates who attended what this meeting becomes known as is the Constitutional Convention. They labored along with each other
No.
for an entire summer trying to create this thing. The majority of the work, just like with the Declaration and calling for independence, was done behind closed doors. The leader of the Constitutional Convention is George Washington. He was chosen to be the leader of the Constitutional Convention. I know it's not showing on the TV, but it's showing on my computer, so we're good. All the delegates of the Constitutional Convention were men. Hence, they are referred to as the Founding Fathers. So have you ever heard that expression, Founding Fathers? Just pause this for a second. Having some technical difficulties. I don't know what happened. Yeah, probably. And so that's why they were referred to as the Founding Fathers. Many of them were quite young. In fact, the vast majority were in their 20s and 30s. Only one person at the Constitutional Convention was what we would consider old. You guys know who that was? Benjamin Franklin. He was 81. Yeah. 17 of these 55 gentlemen owned slaves.
Wait, out of how many?
Out of 55, including George Washington. Actually, George Washington owned the most.
They also make big time.
Mm-hmm. 31 of them actually went to college. So it's a fairly well-educated group. Mm-hmm. That's right, 31 went to college. And they all like to hear themselves speak. Hence why it took an entire summer to write a 5-page document. Constitution's only 5 pages long, guys. It is a short, brief document. It is brief. But not everybody is going to agree. You have a lot of different things happening here. You have people from different regions. You have people from different sections. There's 13 different states involved. People from the east, people from the west, people with education and not education, people that own slaves, people that are against. A lot of different motives going on here. And as a result of that, you have to give in some to get what you want sometimes. What's that called?
Compromise.
And America is built on compromise. America is built on compromise. One of the things that they argued about to a great extent is how the states were going to be represented. Less populous states, like New Jersey, believe it or not, were concerned with being lost in the new system of government and not being treated as equals because their populations were so small. So it's not surprising that a larger state like Virginia wanted to see the apportionment or the government's representation based on the state's population. Meaning, the greater the population, the more representation you get in the government. So that's called the Virginia Plan. That's the plan that they wanted. They wanted the national system of government to be based on the European model where the government's powers are derived from the members of the states. So the more people you have in a state, the more representation that state has. So it's based on population. And then smaller states like New Jersey, Connecticut, they felt more comfortable with how it was under the Articles of Confederation. One state, one vote, regardless of the size. And so their plan was called the New Jersey Plan. So how do we compromise when they both want two completely opposite things? Yeah, you just do both of them. And so instead of having a unicameral or one-house legislature, our government provides for a bicameral legislature, where one house is based upon population, the other is based on equality. Which one's based on population? The Virginia Plan, and that would be the House of Representatives, is what is created out of this. Where, depending upon the size of your state, it all depends on how many votes you get. For example, is West Virginia a very populous state? No, not really. And how many members do we have in the House of Representatives? 3. Is California a populous state?
Yes.
How many members do they have? They have 53. 53. Because their population is much greater. And that's the Virginia plan. What about the New Jersey plan? What house is created where there's equal representation?
The Senate.
The Senate. Can you tell me what the representation is?
2 per state.
2 per state. 2 per state. Does it matter the size of the state? How many senators does California have?
2.
How many senators does West Virginia have? Alaska.
2.
If you're a state, you get 2. Okay? How many senators are there in the United States?
50. 100.
400.
100.
Oh.
100 senators. All right?
I think it's states, sorry.
This is called the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise. And it was probably the most serious disagreement between the Virginia and New Jersey plans. So, but we just create, to break the stalemate, that's what we create. A 2-house bicameral legislature, one based on population and one based on equality. All right. Another issue that I mentioned earlier that the Constitution must address is the issue of slavery. The Great Compromise dealt with one concern of the framers, how to best address the differences between large and small states. But there are other regional differences that remain. Slavery, which formed the basis of much of the southern states' cotton economy, was pretty important to them, and it was one of the most difficult issues to approach. Eventually, the framers agreed that if you are a northern person and you dislike slavery, you want to de-incentivize it. And so they want to try to make it to where slaves do not count in the population count. Because remember, your representation in the House of Representatives is based upon the population of your state. So you want your state to be more populated, that way you have more power. So, did people in the South, did they want slaves to be counted as a full person or not to be counted at all? They wanted their slaves to be counted as a full person. But people in the North said, hey, look, you consider these people your property. They should not be counted in terms of your representation because you don't allow them any rights, and they should not be counted. And so they said, you know what, you're right, let's compromise. Slaves are 3/5 of a human being. Pretty terrible, especially when you say it out loud, but this is how it was. And from 1787 until 1865, slaves in the United States were counted as 3/5 of a human being when it came in terms of apportionment in the House of Representatives. This has obviously since been stricken down with the 15th Amendment, but it is in the Constitution, the 3/5 Amendment, or the 3/5 Compromise, not amendment, 3/5 Compromise. Pretty rough stuff. Okay, so I will stop there for the day.
Oh, ready?
Yeah, I'll stop there. If you have to contact me.